What this meant was, in short, that if something was found by these archaeologists that could be used to support the scriptural teaching of the time, then we, the public, would be informed about it. Anything else was mythology. If it did not suit the interpretation, it was not destined to see the light of day in the public domain. That was 100 years ago. We still suffer from many of these types of regulation today. There is a hell of a lot discovered out there in these countries that we don't get to hear about. It's put under wraps, it's kept in closeted rooms beneath the museums, but we don't get to learn the truth of it. So what we're going to do, I think, today really is just to look at one example of a particularly monumentous find of that era, of the late 1800s. We'll look at one particular discovery just to give you an idea of the sort of thing that has been veiled from us. In my opinion, this is probably the most important biblical discovery ever made. There is little, if anything, beyond academic and closeted circles that are written about it at all. Within the context of the book of Exodus, there's a significant mountain named in the Bible. It sits in the range of the Sinai Peninsula, which is an upturned triangle that's between Egypt and Jordan. It's firstly called Mount Horeb. It's secondly called Mount Sinai. It's then called Mount Horeb again, and that's the name that it sticks with as the story progresses. And the story, of course, is that of Moses bringing the Israelites out of Egypt, and they meet with Jehovah on the holy mountain of Horeb in Sinai. At the time of Moses, roughly 1360 BC, that sort of era, there actually was no mountain called Mount Sinai. We must know that at the outset. There wasn't even a mountain by that name in the time of Jesus, and not even for another 300 or 400 years did Mount Sinai exist in geographical record. The translation of the Old Testament that we have today was compiled in a little before the year 1000. It is actually 600 years newer than the New Testament that we have today. So giving places names that they knew about in the year 1000, when the Crusades were thought about being launched and that sort of thing, they were giving places names that they knew at that time, not necessarily names that applied back in the time of Moses and the others, so that the people of that era would know exactly where they were talking about. Now, the mountain generally called Mount Sinai now sits in the south of that triangular peninsula. It was actually given its name and called Mount Sinai in the 4th century. A mission of Greek Christian monks decided to build a little mission there, and they decided that this was Mount Sinai of the Bible. It's sometimes called Jebel Musa, which means Mount of Moses. And there's a small Christian retreat there today. It's called St. Catherine's Monastery. But was that the mountain that actually was the Mount Sinai of the Bible, or the Mount Horeb of the Bible? It transpires that it was not. Exodus actually goes to some length to explain to us exactly where this magical mountain was. The mountain that Moses and the Israelites went to on their way from Egypt across to the land of Midian. It tells us that they crossed the wilderness regions of Shur and Paran, and they came to this mountain. Well, in actual fact, if one follows the route on the map, exactly the route that's given to us in Exodus, that they are hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the Mount Sinai that sits on our maps today. In fact, they travel so north across Sinai that they are within hundreds of miles of the Red Sea. They actually crossed the strip of land at the top where the Suez Canal sits today. So it seems rather strange that they should have diverted by hundreds of miles to cross the Red Sea at a point where Moses had to part the waters. Wasn't the case. They were very north of that, and it tells us where they went across there. It tells us exactly where Mount Horeb was. The word Horeb is an Arabic word. It simply means desert. Mount Horeb was desert mountain. And desert mountain is something which has been well known for a long, long time And at the moment, this time and for this century, it's been called the mountain of Serabit El Kadim, the prominence of the Kadim. This sits about 2,600 feet above sea level, exactly where Exodus tells us it was, on the route from Egypt, the land of Goshen, across to the land of Midian. When in the late 1890s, the British Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie of the University College in London decided to apply to the Egyptian Exploration Fund for money to go and investigate this mountain. By 1904, he and the team were there. They were standing at the foot of Mount Serabit, and in the following year, Petrie published privately the results of their findings with photographs, records, and maps. But he added to his notes to this publication that the report that he made, despite its funding source, would not generally be made public by the Egyptian Exploration Fund. The subscribers to the fund would receive maps, they would receive little bits of information, but the detail of what they found would not be mentioned at all. The officers would simply tell even their own members what they wanted to tell from the results of Petrie's findings. Why? Had he in fact broken some regulation of the articles? Had he found something that he wasn't supposed to find? Well, that's exactly what had happened. He discovered the secret of this magical, sacred mountain of Moses. A secret which not only made absolute sense of the portrayals that we have in Exodus, but which blew the lid totally from the common scriptural interpretation of that. Sinai was not a foreign land to the Egyptians. It was actually part of Egypt. It came under pharaonic control. So Moses and the Israelites, when they left Egypt and crossed into Sinai, were theoretically, for that moment in time, still in Egypt. Sinai came under the control of some particular public officials. One was called the Royal Chancellor, other was called the Royal Messenger, and these people governed Sinai. Moses' era was the era of Egypt's 18th dynasty, and in fact we know exactly who the governors of Sinai were in the 18th dynasty. We know their names, we know their families. The Royal Messenger was a guy called Nebi, and he was also mayor and troop commander in the set town of Zaru, which in fact was the chief town in Goshen where the Israelites had come from. It's where they spent their years in Egypt. The Royal Chancellor was held in the family of Par-Nihas. Panahesi of this family was the official governor of Sinai at the time. The family of Par-Nihas goes right back into the kingship of ancient Troy. It's a family that moves through kingship all the way through history, and at that time Par-Nihas was governing Canaan. The Bible calls him Phineas. So when we read about Phineas becoming one of the first priests of the Egyptian church, of the Israelite church, this is Par-Nihas. This is the governor of Sinai, a very important man. Another thing to understand before we follow Petrie into the discovery is that there was an immense difference at the time, although the Bible doesn't make it clear, between a group of people called Hebrews and a group of people called Israelites. They weren't the same thing at all. The Hebrews were the family descendants of Abraham. They were descendants of his line, and in essence, they lived in the land of Canaan and in Palestine. The Israelites were no more nor less than the descendants of one of Abraham's grandsons. This was the grandson called Jacob, who changed his name to Israel, who took the family to Egypt, where they spent many centuries before coming out with Moses. And this family were called Israelites, children of Israel, the founder of the family. So what we have to recognize about the story of the mountain of Moses is that when Moses came out of Egypt, he came out of Egypt with Israelites, not with Hebrews. The whole point of the story of the laws and the ordinances given at Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, was really a part of bringing the Israelites back into the Hebrew community, a foreign land, where they actually had to learn new rules, new regulations, new laws, to be part of the family that they themselves originally grew from. So that's kind of where it sits. Israelites were not Hebrews. In time to come, the word Jews comes up in history, Judeans. They weren't necessarily Hebrews or Israelites, they were simply people who lived in Judea. Today, all of these words get roped into one, and they're sort of one people. So the Israelites had spent something like 400 odd years living in a part of Egypt, up there in the Nile Delta, in the land of Goshen, the city of which was Zaru. Through 400 years, having no contacts personally, hardly at all, with their Hebrew relatives in Canaan, they grew up in a completely different environment. They grew up in an environment that didn't have this single Jehovah God as their God. They grew up in a country with a pantheon of gods. It was the Egyptian law that they followed. However, being of the family that they were, they still hit upon the idea of following a kind of Hebrew concept. And they had a one God concept among themselves in Goshen. They simply called this God Lord, Adonai, my Lord. And this is one of the reasons why the names Lord and Jehovah crop up independently in the Bible. But we read them as if they're talking about the same person. For the most part, they're not. One God was the Lord, the other God was Jehovah. Jehovah was strictly for the Hebrews. To the Egyptians, the name Adon was pronounced Aten, A-T-E-N, and it's from that we get the name of Pharaoh Akhenaten, servant of Aten. This was a one-God concept which Akhenaten brought into Egypt just before the time of Moses. So even Egypt had within that Goshen area this one God ideal. Across the water, the Hebrews had the one God ideal, but it was a different God. So when Moses came into Sinai with the Israelites, they didn't arrive as worshippers of Jehovah when they got to this magic mountain. They were worshippers of Aten. And it was for this very reason, as I mentioned, that they were given a whole new set of laws and ordinances to comply with the Hebrew culture of their prospective new homeland. So back to Flinders Petrie. He goes to the mountain, and he knows that there's going to be something there. Quite how he knows, he doesn't explain, but he knows that this is the mountain, and he knows that if he looks hard enough, he's going to find a secret there. Well, to start with, they found nothing very much at all. But on a wide plateau, very near the summit of this mountain, they found things that made them believe there had been habitation there. There were things around that looked like buildings sticking out of this plateau, 2,600 feet up a mountain. There were great pillars, standing stones protruding out of a whole heap of rubble. So he decided to have a look and see what was underneath this rubble. This rubble had been deposited by winds and landslides over 3,000 years. But when it was finally moved away, Petrie wrote at that time, "There is no other monument known which makes us regret more that it is not in better preservation. The whole of this was buried. No one had any knowledge of it until we cleared the site." What they found high up on Mount Horeb, 2,000 feet above sea level, was an enormous Egyptian temple. 230 feet of it spread out above ground, another part of it spread out within a cave below ground, cut into the mountainside with shored edges and polished sides. And the various inscriptions and cartouches around this temple and on the walls and the standing stones led him to discover that this had been an operative Egyptian temple right back to the time of the very first dynasty of Egypt. We're looking at Moses in the 18th dynasty of Egypt, so that's going back a long, long way. And this temple had been operative all through that time, 3000 BC. The above ground part of the temple was mostly sandstone, quarried from the mountain itself. It comprised a series of halls and corridors, shrines, cubicles, chambers, and of these, the features that are now open for inspection are the main sanctuary, the Shrine of Kings, the portico court. These are big. The hall of the goddess Hathor. The whole of this temple complex that Moses took the Israelites to, where they apparently met with Jehovah to receive the Ten Commandments and the new ordinances, was a temple of the goddess Hathor. She appears on reliefs all around the place. The cave cut into the rock is dedicated to Hathor. The walls that are smoothed and polished like marble have her pictures all over them. And yet this is supposed to be the magic mountain of Jehovah. Deep within the cave, Petrie found a limestone standing stone of the pharaoh Ramesses I. Now, all of the experts today tell us that Ramesses was a hater of the Aten cult in Egypt. Not what Ramesses himself said. He describes himself with the title, I am Ramesses, I am the ruler of all that Aten embraces. So the experts are telling us untruths even today about what these pharaohs were about. Also found was a statue head of the mother of Moses within this temple. So it proved that not only had it been in constant use right back from about 3000 BC, even by the time that Moses got there in about 1330 BC, it was already being used in that recent period. It was constantly in use, this great temple. In the halls and the courts of the outer temple, there are stone tanks, rectangular basins and baths and all sorts of curiously shaped tables and benches that nobody could make any sense out of. They didn't look like altars. They had recessed fronts, they had split level surfaces, and the whole thing reminded them more of a laboratory than it did of a temple. There were alabaster vases, there were containers, and all these are shaped like lotus flowers and things like that. There are all sorts of articles there. There were wands there. They called them wands. They were like little priest sticks. And even today, they can't quite work out what they're made of. The material is very, very hard. These things are all designed, but they're not designed in the normal Egyptian style. They have basket work. They have lattice work. They have a style of design that is more Mesopotamian than Egyptian. And yet, this is an Egyptian temple. They also found a few other very strange things. When they move into the Hathor temple complex, which appears to be the central point at where all of this energy comes from, they begin to find some strange things. Conical stones set very carefully on a shelf, little cones of stone. A metallurgist's crucible was very apparent. Now these kind of things began to get Petrie and his people wondering, well, what on earth had these things got to do with a temple? There was nothing in temple law that said that metallurgist crucibles were part of what went on. And all over the temple, all over the walls and on the various stones was something venerated, highly venerated within the temple complex, and it was called mufkuts. Doesn't mean a lot to us today, mufkuts. Okay, mufkuts. They found 2,600 feet above sea level in the mountain of the Bible, conical stones, metallurgist crucibles, tanks, basins, lotus flower equipment, all sorts of wands and tubing that look like a laboratory, and references venerating some mysterious substance called mufkuts. Now, they knew that these things were all linked together, but they didn't know how. So they began to try and work out what on earth mufkuts was. Some said it was probably copper. Many preferred the idea of turquoise. Others have supposed it was perhaps malachite. But the funny thing about these guesses was that none of these materials was apparent within the temple complex. There was no malachite, there was no turquoise, there was no copper. Sinai is noted for its turquoise mines, but if mining had been a primary function of that temple over 2,000 to 3,000 years, you'd expect to find turquoise stones in the tombs of Egypt. There are barely any at all. So if they were working for 3,000 years mining turquoise, they clearly only found about half a dozen. Copper, they said. Well, it didn't take them long to realize that if you were mining and smelting copper, you need very different equipment to this sort of equipment. This was not metal rectification equipment in the way that they knew it. Copper was apparent in Sinai, but down in the deep valleys there were smelting works, old smelting works, and they were nothing like this temple at all. There was no residue of copper anywhere except references to mufkuts. Another cause of wonderment as they travelled around this, as they kept removing all of this rubble, was that they kept seeing inscribed references to bread. Everywhere there were references to bread, and bread was always written alongside mufkuts. The other thing that happened all the time was that the most prominent of all the hieroglyphic signs outside that was the sign for light. Now, bread and light and mufkuts all seem to be equally important within this temple complex. This was nothing to do with copper. It had something to do with these strange tanks, these strange laboratory tables with their recessed fronts and split-level surfaces. So, bread, mufkuts, light, conical stones, metallurgists, crucibles, all of these posed a problem until they decided to clear the rubble from a series of square storerooms in one of the parts of the temple. As they removed the rubble, they came across slabs of stone beneath the rubble. They moved the slabs of stone, and beneath these, carefully stored in every one of about 4 or 5 of these large square rooms, a few inches deep, packed tight on the floor, were tons and tons of the finest, purest, unadulterated white powder. So, said the experts, this is clearly the result of copper smelting. This clearly was from the burning of plants to produce alkali. Quite why they would want to produce alkali, nobody really knew, but the more they tested it, the more they found that there was no plant residue there at all. And in fact, if they were going to have a temple for the burning of plants, they actually would have done better down in the valleys where there were more trees, not 2,600 feet up a mountain. So for want of any other explanation, it was decided that the white powder and the stones were perhaps associated with the sacrificial rite. They're clinging at straws here all the time, trying to work out what on earth this was. This is probably animal sacrifice. Well, as pointed out by somebody who wasn't even the brightest member of the team, this was an Egyptian temple. There is nothing anywhere in history which says that the Egyptians ever used animal sacrifice for anything. It wasn't part of their religious structure at all. They tested the powder, they winnowed it in the breeze, they did everything they could. There was not a bone, a chip, a stone, a piece of plant, a piece of skin, anything in this powder. And it was described as being hard-packed talcum powder, which was impalpable to touch and just blew away in the breeze the moment you flicked it into the air. Petrie wrote, "Though I searched these ashes in dozens of instances, winnowing them in a breeze, I never found a fragment of bone, skin, plant, or anything else." So some of the mysterious powder was sent back to Britain for analysis and examination. The results, for what they were never actually published. When people went back to have a look at the rest of the powder, and they reckoned there was about 50 tons of this, it had all, of course, been left a victim to the desert winds and erosion and rainfall and whatever, and that was the end of that. What became apparent, however, when checking out other inscriptions at the temple, was that this mufkuts, this powder, had something to do with what the Mesopotamians called highwood firestone. It's the same thing. Mufkuts turned out to be highwood firestone. They called it the sacred Shem Anna, from which derived, of course, the biblical word manna. And this is the importance of the word bread that kept appearing through the thing. There was some tie-up between this powder and the Shem Anna of the Mesopotamians. Light, the word light was always there. Whenever Shem Anna was mentioned, whenever mufkuts or highwood firestone was mentioned, the symbol for light was always there alongside it. It was decided, and it turns out probably quite correctly, that this mufkut was exactly the same powder that the book of Exodus actually talks about. It tells us about powder. It tells us about the Israelites being fed with a particular powder at that time. It tells about the importance of manufacturing something called showbread for the tabernacle and the altar of the temple. Showbread is exactly the same as show manna, and shemana is exactly what the Mesopotamians used to call it. It's the same thing. But the book of Exodus tells us that the guy who made the showbread for Moses' tabernacle was a guy called Bezaleel. Now, Bezaleel, it goes to great pains to tell us, was a goldsmith and a master craftsman. So this fellow has got the instructions, and they're laid down in the Bible for us to read, to make candlesticks, to make golden bowls, to make platters, to make all the ornaments for the Ark of the Covenant, and to make this bread, the goldsmith. Master craftsman is a particularly important word, and the more I looked for this definition, master craftsman, the more I found, going back and back and back in time. The definition exists way back to about 4000 BC. These were the great Vulcans, the texts tell us. The master craftsmen were the great Vulcans. They were the people in charge of the furnaces. They were the people who made the highwood firestone. So as for the crucible and the conical stones and the tanks and the tables and all of the equipment at Sinai, it was actually determined by the Petrie team that this temple was clearly a laboratory. So the report went back to London, and I began by telling you what they didn't tell us. What they'd found was the alchemical workshop of the pharaoh Akhenaten and of the 18 dynasties of pharaohs before him. A temple laboratory where the furnace smoked and roared, just as the book of Exodus tells us, in the production of the highwood firestone, the shemana. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. The smoke ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the mountain quaked greatly. That's what it tells us. Prior to that, it came to pass that when the sun went down, it was dark, and behold, there was a smoking furnace. A burning lamp passed between the pieces. The burning bush seen by Moses, which was a fire, a blaze, exploded, but was not consumed, and an angel came out of it. If you think about it, it's pretty well identical to the experiment that David Hudson did with his pencil. The blaze of light. It had no effect on the object within it. It's the same story. In Exodus we read that Moses took the golden calf. We're now on the mountain. The Israelites had made a golden calf. He burnt it in the fire and ground it to a powder. Now, nobody has actually queried these words, it seems to me, but if you burn gold in a fire, you get molten. It's a white powder. This was exactly the process of a shemana furnace, as the Egyptian records tell us. And that's precisely what was going on at this temple. They were actually making this stuff. 50 tons of it. Moses' own great-grandfather was the pharaoh Thutmose III. Thutmose III had reorganized the ancient mystery schools of Thoth in Egypt and founded the royal school of the master craftsmen at Karnak. At the time they called them the Great White Brotherhood because of their preoccupation with a mysterious white powder. A branch of the fraternity became known as the Therapeutate. They were a healing community, so this had something to do with medicine as well. The Therapeutate, in fact, set up branches all over Palestine and Syria, and a branch of that Therapeutate were the Essenes at Qumran in the time of Jesus. So clearly, these guys were into this as well. Hathor. All of this is dedicated to Hathor, not to Jehovah. She was the great mother. She is the oldest identified deity figure of Egypt. She turns up on the oldest artifact ever known from 3000 odd BC. And her story, when it's being told in documented form, runs in parallel with a historical character called the great Vulcan, Tubal-Cain. Now, Tubal-Cain is actually mentioned in the Bible. Tubal-Cain was one of the descendants of Cain in the line from Eve. Tubal-Cain, even today, is revered by Freemasons worldwide. They don't know why. They just know that Tubal-Cain was very important and that Tubal-Cain was a master metallurgist. He was a great Vulcan. Now, Hathor's particularly interesting in Egypt because Hathor's not only there at the very beginning of Egyptian time, she's there at the very, very end of it. Right at the end of the Pharaonic era, when Queen Cleopatra is sort of winding down the whole thing and the Romans are moving in, and we're in about 30, 40 BC, she's the penultimate pharaoh of them all, make sure that she has her one and only relief of her carved on the Temple of Hathor. Hathor was a nursing goddess. Hathor was said to be the daughter of Ra. She was said to have given birth to the sun. She was the queen of the West. She was the one who knew the right spells, whatever they were. She was the protectress of womanhood, the lady of the sycamore, wine, tombs, song. But the importance of Hathor was that it was from the powdered milk of Hathor that the pharaohs gained their divinity. Now, we know now what the powdered milk of Hathor was. It was the powder being manufactured at the Hathor temple. They wondered at the time why this would not have been done in Egypt. But as I said earlier, Sinai was Egypt. It was the same country. It just happened to be the other side of the water. Now, one of the rock carvings by the cave at the mountain is a representation of Moses' own great-grandfather, Thutmose IV, in the presence of Hathor. And on this wonderful carved relief stands topped with lotus flowers and a man presenting Thutmose with a loaf of white bread. A conical loaf of white bread. Another stela details the mason, Ankib, offering 2 conical bread cakes to the king. And there are portrayals of this all throughout this temple, these bread cakes, the importance of the muskets, Hathor giving her divinity to the pharaoh. The man whose dynasty, and priests were dynastic as well as kings, the man whose dynasty went right through the government of this temple from the earliest times to the time even of Moses was a dynasty called Sobek-Hotep. And Sobek-Hotep is described as the overseer of the mountain and the overseer of the secrets of the house of gold. So there is no doubt whatever that we're dealing here with gold, and everything pointed to it as far as Petrie was concerned. But the Egypt Exploration Fund would have nothing to do with this. Reason being that in telling that story, which was a much more exciting story, we were not telling the story of the Ten Commandments and Moses and Jehovah on the mountain that the Bible told. Irrespective of the fact that this explains it better, this explains why they ended up on a mountain hundreds of miles off route, it's still better for them not to tell the story. Hathor was portrayed particularly by the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty. When you see their pictures, these old kingdom pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, Hathor is always there beside them. The 4th dynasty was the great dynasty of pyramid building. Pyramid building was directly related to this temple and the house of gold. That's how they got their name. The word Pyr, P-Y-R, means fire. Pyramid simply denotes something that is begotten by fire. Hathor is very important in the pyramid era. She's very important to the pharaohs of that era, the pharaohs that were said to have built the great pyramids of Giza. What was the link, I wondered, and I thought, well, I'm going to read these reports of Petrie, so I actually managed to get the reports to find out what was going on here. And Petrie was bothered by the same thing. He couldn't actually work out why this nursing goddess, this goddess whose milk gave the pharaoh's divinity, was associated with building pyramids. Well, the answer actually was very, very clear-cut. Under the right circumstances, this powder is perfectly capable of transposing its own aspects to other things. This powder, if you remember the Hudson experiments, actually had its own weightlessness. It was exotic matter. Now, one of the great researchers into gravity from the 1960s was the Russian physicist Sakharov. And he wrote a lot about gravity at a 0 point. And he said this powder is exotic matter. He explained that it had, under testing, a gravitational attraction of less than 0. It weighed not only nothing, but this powder could weigh less than nothing. It's wholly exotic, he said. This powder can be made to move into a different dimension if we want it to. Not only can it itself weigh less than nothing, but its host can weigh less than nothing. Now, if you remember again the Hudson talks, remember the pan? The powder was in the pan. Not only did the powder lose its weightlessness, but so does the pan. So what emerges from this is that actually it doesn't matter whether it's a pan or a saucer or an enormous great block of stone. Many of you will know the story. Moses had been up the mountain. He'd come down with the Ten Commandments, and then he broke the tablets because he got terribly angry to see that his brother Aaron had collected all the gold earrings from the Israelites and melted them down and made a golden calf as an idol of worship. And he said, well, that may be the way we used to do things. We don't do that anymore. We have this new culture here that we're part of, and I've just spoken to the Lord of this culture, and we don't worship graven images anymore. And he got very angry. And then it says this, that he took the golden calf, he burnt it with fire, he transposed it with powder, mixed that with water, and fed it to the Israelites. Interesting little story. He took the gold, burnt it with fire, and transposed it into powder. That doesn't work. You heat gold with fire or burn gold with fire, you get molten gold. You don't get powder. Nobody, it seems, thought to ask the question. They use this, it says, to make bread. They could mix it with frankincense, the Bible tells us, and mold little bread cakes, which the most ancient Bible text that we have, the Septuagint, the old Greek Bible, calls bread of the presence, presumably bread of the presence of God or of something important. Shemana means firestone. This is a relief from that temple, another relief showing a bread presentation again. It was always linked with bread. They were always little conical shapes. We know that from about 2,500 BC, the pharaohs in Egypt, or the kings before they became pharaohs in Greek times, were ingesting the bread cakes of this white powder substance. Only the metallurgical adepts knew the secret of its manufacture. Metallurgical adepts, yep, it's made from metal, that makes sense. The high priest of the temples had a very strange title. The high priests of the Egyptian temples were called the great artificers. Well, a great artificer is a worker in materials, particularly metals. So that was sort of interesting. It's beginning to link together, and thinking back to Petrie's concept, yeah, these were places of worship, not worship. Temples were not the same as churches that evolved from the concept. I actually looked in just the English language word etymological dictionary from Oxford University. It traces the origin of words, and lo and behold, I only had to go back 700 years to discover that the word we now use as worship had a K in the middle of it. It was worship. They used to work for the gods. They didn't used to worship the gods. They used to work for the gods, whoever the gods were. It was said that this was the food of the light body. They said we all have bodies, but we don't just have physical bodies, we have light bodies. And just as we feed our physical bodies, they said, we have to feed our light bodies so that they will be nurtured and grow in the same way. They have to be as fulfilled as the physical body. And they call the light body the car. Well, it's interesting because scientists in recent times have actually called this material the light of life, because it resonates with DNA on the same frequencies. It's a light wave. We find lots of references to Mufkut. This relief here, this picture, this drawing was actually done by the Russian scholar Immanuel Velikovsky, and he drew this up simply to give us an image of this relief at Karnak, at the Temple of Karnak. This shows the treasures of the pharaoh Thutmose the third. Mufkut in Egyptian law was always portrayed as a cone shape. Now these things sit there in the gold section, and it says underneath, these are gold, but we call them bread. 1450 BC, roughly, Thutmose founded at this temple at Karnak a college, an institute at the temple of scholarly, priestly types who were called the Great White Brotherhood. The Alexandrians wrote of them and said they were called the Great White Brotherhood because they were absolutely obsessed with a mysterious white powder. And they made some interesting comments. They said that they call it the Paradise Stone, and it has unique qualities inasmuch as that it can weigh far more than its own original quantity of gold. But even a feather can tip the scales against it. So it can be a lot heavier than the gold it came from, or it can be lighter than a feather. This stuff has the ability to change its weight very, very dramatically. It's always, in the old text, associated with light, with enlightenment, with illumination of some sort. It's a light illumination that seems to have to do with the acquisition of knowledge and wisdom, that sort of illumination and enlightenment. They're activating bits of our system now with this material that never seemed to have any purpose before. Why do we only use a fraction of our brain power? Why don't we use the rest? Well, it's there to be used if we knew what to do with it. We need the trigger. We need the unlocking device. These materials are it. They're what was used to feed the car, the light body, to give anti-aging, to restore the youth, to take the pharaohs into the afterlife or whatever. There's an institute in Switzerland called the Alpha Learning Institute. The chief research director there is a fellow called Sean Adam. Sean Adam for 10 years has been the world's memory and speed reading champion. He can read a 300 book in 24 minutes. He reads at a speed of 3,850 words a minute. Not only can he do all of that, he remembers it all, and he can be tested on anything. He's also got, he's joint holder of the 6th highest IQ ever recorded. So this guy has been running with others this research institute for the longest time, which is linked up to government and corporate institutions, and they specialize in learning difficulties, in behavioral patterns and behavioral difficulties, anything that might be linked to behavioral science, along to finding cures for dyslexia, ADHD, learning deficiencies, things of that sort. And they're the primary institute in the world for fronting these things. Well, from October 2002 until January 2003, as a little 3 to 4 month period there, they decided to test monatomic elements. 10 volunteers, 5 male, 5 female, average age somewhere between 17 and 52, and they were fed simply orally with these materials, with monatomic elements, these powders, regularly and irregularly, just to test the reaction. Well, the results were, in their words, staggering. Sean Adam, he wrote, "What we are seeing here is really quite amazing. The tests show it to be highly effective. The effect is immediate and cumulative." What they do here is to work on brainwave patterns, and they try to synchronize these things, and they found that this material could do it. The theory and the logic behind it is that the better balancing between left and right brain produces, and these are their words, a greater intelligence, enhanced creativity, improved mind-body coordination, more agility and less stress. Well, okay, that makes sense. If we're operating as we should be, that's what we should have. But we're none of us really operating as we should be. We're operating with all of this left brain thing going and not too much of the right. Well, here are the charts here. These are just average charts. There are hundreds and hundreds of these. They took everybody's brainwave scans as they were going along. Now the top chart shows a normal starting base, where in effect, and this would be any one of us at any moment in time, the brain waves coming off the left side were far outweighing those, the red ones, on the right-hand side of the brain. The effects, they say, is immediate and cumulative. At the bottom is the first immediate effect. What happens is that the left has now contracted back to meet the right, and the right's grown just a little bit, but they've absolutely synchronized. The left and the right brain of this person, and this is the immediate effect, has now begun. And then they say it's cumulative, because what then happens is that it all grows to where the blue one was at the beginning. Quite extraordinary. Our research clearly shows that the left-right brain imbalances predominate in many mental behavioral dysfunctions, such as dyslexia and ADHD. It is our professional opinion that the Monatomic products would be of tremendous benefit in any of these conditions. It is the most obvious answer as a healthy alternative to chemicals that have harmful side effects. To that, Sean Adam, the director, adds, if I were going to take an exam, mental or physical, I would take monatomic elements immediately beforehand. The worst that could happen is that there would be a little improvement. There could be a lot. What about somebody who's permanently doing this, getting those into balance and growing with it? This is exactly what the old texts told us that these things would do. They made them into bread cakes. They fed them to the priests. They fed them to the pharaohs. It gave them longevity. It gave them extra creativity. It enhanced their perception. It enhanced their intuition. It enhanced their awareness. All the qualities of leadership came from the mufkat, from the shamana, from these golden cakes that they called bread. It's clear from the evidence of all these ancient things that it didn't matter what they called things. It didn't matter that they didn't understand perhaps the true science that we're beginning to understand now. What they did know is that it worked. It did certain things. And they told us about that. So even if they didn't understand it, they presented things as sort of communicating with gods and priests who were able to disappear before their very eyes and things. But these are all things that this enables to be done now. In Greek mythology, it was the one substance that sat right at the very heart of the Golden Fleece legend. It was what the quest was all about, the secrets of manufacture of this material. It's linked up with the Ark of the Covenant, that famous golden coffer that Moses had built at the mountain in Sinai and took to Jerusalem, where the temple was constructed to house it. So this most valuable artifact, the Ark of the Covenant, was entirely tied up with this science in some way, as we shall see. Mysterious processes concerning gold and things automatically ring alchemy bells. Pictures of wonderful wizened old chaps in medieval times with all sorts of potions and fires and things burning away, all trying to perfect this thing called the Philosopher's Stone, which Harry Potter has reminded us of yet again. It was in the middle 1600s, 1660, that Britain's Royal Society was founded and established and chartered by King Charles II, and it was that establishment of that society that embodied and led to the great discoveries of people like Christopher Wren, of Edmund Halley, of Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and all of these tremendous characters that emerged in the 1660s and 70s to make scientific discoveries that had never been made before. And most of those were made on the back of the fact that they were pursuing alchemy. They were searching for the Philosopher's Stone, and during the course of it they made lots of other discoveries. Just like today in space research we get for our households all sorts of other wonderful spin-offs. The discoveries of things like gravity and whatever were spin-offs from looking for the Philosopher's Stone. There was one particular fellow classified today as an alchemist, although he was simply called a philosopher at the time. He was truly revered as a great master by the Newtons and others of the day. This fellow was called Irenaeus Philalathus. And for Irenaeus Philalathus was reckoned to be the ultimate master in that period. And Philalathus had got a little bit fed up with the church propaganda about the Philosopher's Stone being some silly device to turn base elements into gold and whatever, and he thought he'd publish material and put the record straight in the public domain. So in 1667 in Amsterdam he had a work published called Secrets Revealed. And in this he discussed the Philosopher's Stone, its nature, its qualities, what they knew about it. But most important, he made this point: our stone is nothing but gold. Our stone is nothing but gold. It's gold digested to the highest degree of purity and subtle fixation. We call it a stone only because of its fixed nature, because it resists the action of fire as successfully as any stone. In species, it's more pure than any gold that it comes from, but its appearance is that of a very fine white powder. That was the Philosopher's Stone, straight from the hand of the most famous chemist, alchemist of his time. We go back 200 years, we go back to the 15th century. We can look at the last testament of Nicholas Flamel, probably the best known of all the great alchemists of all time. A fellow who spent 20 years from a very poor base studying his science and ended up probably as the greatest and wealthiest benefactor that France has ever known. He made the point on the 22nd of November 1416, when writing his last testament, exactly the same. Our stone is gold, but it's perfectly prepared gold. It's a fine powder of gold. That is our Philosopher's Stone. So we have a whole new perspective here. We have a perspective that says the Philosopher's Stone, despite all the propaganda, despite all the church has done to try and make it look silly, is not about turning anything into gold. It is gold. It's gold in the highest possible, purest form that it ever could be. And that white powder that we looked at earlier was exactly that. That was 24 karat gold. What's the gold that the Philosopher's Stone makes? The Great Enlightenment. Not the great enlightenment of money and wealth and riches and a lump of gold. The great enlightenment of wisdom and learning and intuition. That's the real Holy Grail. That's the true enlightenment. We can leap forward in time now and see how these old stories match up with what's been going on. And it begins right here in the United States. It begins in 1976, and it begins in Phoenix, Arizona. A very, very apt place, actually, because the word Phoenix was Old Phoenician and it means red gold. It all began with a farmer, a cotton farmer, a third-generation cotton farmer just outside Phoenix called David Hudson. This is a picture of David Hudson as he was about 5 years ago. He's your average American farmer. He wasn't a physicist, he wasn't a scientist, he was nothing. He certainly wasn't an alchemist. He was destined to become all of them. His father had been Commissioner of Agriculture for the state of Arizona. They were farming about 70,000 acres in the Yuma Valley there, and they were growing cotton of very, very high grade. But they had a problem with their soil. Big problem with the soil. The soil was enormously alkaline. In fact, it's a strange soil there. There's no topsoil in it. There's no real nutrient as such that's apparent. It's just eroded rock dust. That's all it is. Very strange material. Its surface becomes very black and very crunchy, to the point where at the end of a growing season, once the crop's been picked, over the ensuing months this stuff gets so hard that it will not be penetrated by water. Now, it's not an area where it rains a lot, but their irrigation trucks were having no use with it. And this had gone on for generations. And David thought, well, it's about time to have a look at this and to try and work out what this stuff is, because it means that we have to work in rotation and we can only plant our crops in that field every 3 years. What they did to start with was that they take this substance And they could see that it was a combination substance, some of which was just nasty black stuff, but within it there were these white elements that really seemed to show up within it, and they wanted to know what they were, because this seemed to be the thing that was the problem. So they took it into the lab, they cleaned it all up, they actually got this stuff out of the black material into a precipitate, and what they then had to do was to dry that out so that they could test it. Well, the strangest thing was happening. They decided the best way to dry it was simply to take the filter papers and put them out in the sunshine, just to put them outside. The moment they did that, it exploded. Now, it hadn't been that the farmland had been exploding, but the moment they separated this material and put it in the sun, something about the heat or the light exploded it. And it was explained as if it was like a flash of 40 or 50,000 flashbulbs all going off at once. Not only that, it disappeared. They thought, well, that's really strange. You know, is this an implosion or an explosion? What's going on here? It's like a great blast of this light. So they took an unsharpened pencil and just stood it on end in the sample, in the filter paper. Just stood it there. Bang, white light, it's gone. The pencil's still there. It hasn't blown over. It's not been affected by this. There's no blast. So they said, okay, this needs cleverer testing than we've got. So up they go to Cornell University. Now at Cornell at that time, they said that they got this amazing new equipment, and this equipment could test anything that you'd got down to 3 to 5 parts per billion. So they put it on their machines, and they came back and they said, it's iron and silica and aluminum. They said, well, it can't be. None of those things disappear in a blaze of white light. No, I mean, none of them have these properties. There must be more to it than that. So they tested them again, and they discovered that actually the reading that they were getting was just a little impurity at the front level. It was reaching the boiling point of these particular substances. And once they got rid of them, and they were less than 1% of the whole, once they got rid of them and tested 99% plus of the sample, they said, we can tell you exactly what you've got. Pure nothing. You have nothing that our machine will read. It will not acknowledge that there's anything on there being tested. It's nothing. So they said, okay, we'll try arc emission spectroscopy. Very, very simple process. 2 electrodes. The bottom one has a cup in it. You place your sample in the bottom cup. You bring the other one down and you strike an arc. That arc heats up and ionizes what's in the sample, and one by one, as it reaches the boiling temperatures of each of the constituent elements, it will read them off and tell you what's there. So if, for example, you put a motor car engine in there, its first reading would tell you it was water, because it was reading the cooling system. When the water had all boiled away, it would then tell you it was metal. So that's the way it works. So anyway, they put the stuff in there, and the same thing happened. They said it was iron, silica, and aluminum, and that was it. Nothing was recognizing it. It was not listed. It was totally unknown to science, this strange white material that would disappear from vision. Well, then the Russians came along. The Soviet Academy of Sciences. We're now into the 1980s, well into the 1980s, and the Russians said, we've been telling you guys in the West for the longest time, you really haven't got much of a clue when it comes to analysing materials. Your electrodes burn away before you can reach the boiling temperature of some of your materials. Carbon has a lower boiling temperature. These electrodes are made of carbon. They're burning away before whatever it is has heated up enough. So it's not reading it. Russians said you need to burn this in an arc for 300 seconds, not 15, which was common in the West. 300, 5 minutes. So they go back to base and they put the material in, and it begins. Within 15 seconds, iron, silica, aluminum. They all expected that, and then it's nothing. But the arc now is carrying on burning, whereas the Western style one stopped. And suddenly, at 70 seconds, it says it's palladium. After palladium reads platinum. After that, as the various boiling temperatures were reached, came ruthenium, rhodium, iridium, and at 220 seconds, osmium. Every one of the platinum group metals was in this substance. It was them. It just wasn't showing up at them as them in a metallic way. And in fact, when they worked out the content of these soil samples, it was discovered that per ounces of substance per ton of soil, they had 7,500 times more platinum in every ton of their soil than they were getting from every ton in the best platinum mine in South Africa. But it wasn't metal. You couldn't make jewellery with it. Suddenly Hudson discovered that General Electric up in Massachusetts were looking at a new sort of fuel cell technology. And he said, look, I've got this stuff here, and it says in your literature that you're using rhodium and iridium and these platinum group metals for fuel cells. Your reports say that you're experiencing very strange phenomenon. You're experiencing blazing white lights and explosions and disappearing tricks and things. And they said, yeah. And he said, well, I've got some stuff that does that. And they said, yeah, don't worry about the white light explosions. We know all about those. Don't worry about the disappearing tricks. We know all about those. And he said, great, tell me all about them. And they said, no, I mean, we don't understand them. We just know about them. We know that it happens. And that's where we're leaving it. You know, it happens. We don't want to understand it. We want to make fuel cells. Well, David wanted to understand it. It was then decided that since this stuff was going to be proven as a kind of material that could be used in fuel cells, they said you ought to get down to the patent office and lodge a patent on this. You know, you need to lodge it because somebody else could discover it and stop you from working with it. So that's what he did. And there's a portion in the application where you have to do tests with weights and measures. Well, the funny thing about this material was that they'd noticed that its weight was fluctuating. So he said, well, like when? You know, at what stage do we weigh it? They said, well, you're just going to have to keep heating it and cooling it and heating it and cooling it and seeing what the mean weight is. So they got this machine, which is called a thermogravimetric analyzer, and they started doing this weighing. Well, it was actually quite remarkable. They managed to get readings during heating that took it to a weight of less than 0. They managed to get readings during cooling that took it to anything up to 700 times its original weight. Think of the Alexandrian Paradise Stone. These powders will outweigh the original quantity of gold. They can also be lighter than a feather. That was exactly what it was doing. But during the process, there was one particular moment in time where the weight fell very quickly and very dramatically at that moment, and it fell by 44% suddenly. But what they noticed was something really odd, because the less than 0 weight that they were getting didn't make a lot of sense. It was sitting there in a pan in the lab on effectively weighing equipment. The pan itself weighs something. You have to compensate for it before you put the other material in it. But what they discovered was that it was reading all of these 0 weights, below 0, but they thought, well, what about the pan? That should weigh something. So they tipped the material out and put the pan back, and it suddenly weighed more without the material in it than it did when it was in it. This stuff was not only levitating, it was carrying the pan with it. And they learned that this stuff has the power to give levitational qualities to its host. So they carried on and they thought, well, we've got to do these other things for the application. We've got to see if it's conductive. That was the next test they had to do. So they put wires and electrodes into it, attached them to a voltmeter, turned on the power, nothing. And then they thought, well, it's got to be a conductor of some sort, because if it's capable of holding energy, you know, how are General Electric doing it? You know, it has to be conductive. Anyway, it turned out that it was a superconductor rather than a conductor. Superconductors are very, very strange animals. They don't need contacts to convey to each other. They convey to each other through resonant frequencies, through lights. The interesting thing is that if you transmit electricity from A to B with a wire, you always get some dispersion. You always lose some energy. With this, you lose nothing. 100% can go from there to there, no contact in between, 100% stays. It works so differently because it doesn't allow voltage potential to exist within itself. Neither does it
allow any magnetic field to exist within itself. It's totally null. It doesn't react to North Pole, South Pole. It has its own quality, and its own quality defines all the laws. Here we have a standard magnet. We have North and South Pole. It's the magnet we all use. It will attract metals. And in fact, even if you put above it something that it won't attract, it'll fall down onto it because gravity will just take it there. That superconductor doesn't. Wants nothing to do with it. Won't be attracted by it, won't particularly be repelled by it, but it's just placed there above it and it'll just stay wherever it's put. We know that its anti-gravity properties can be translated to its host. We know that the scale of that doesn't seem to matter. It's macrocosm, microcosm, big, small, has nothing to do with these superconductors. So in as much as that tons of it were discovered at this Egyptian temple, dating back to the 4th dynasty at the time they were building the pyramids, and we know that this stuff was very capable of transferring its weightlessness to the pan in the lab or whatever else one might associate it with, it would be equally as capable of helping them move the most enormous stones to build pyramids, which incidentally the stones themselves contain. You don't even have to get them from outside. Sandstones and limestones contain these elements in a natural form. And it's very interesting to think now that of all of the ways that they thought perhaps these stones were moved, none of them have ever worked in experiment or trial. This does. So they discovered that this stuff would levitate, they discovered it would disappear, they didn't quite know why or where it went to, and they knew that it was important for energy. They knew that if it was a superconductor it could attract energy, it could store energy, and it could distribute energy. Yeah, fuel cell, that's what we're looking at here. The old stories of the powder and the Ark of the Covenant began to ring bells here about this potential that they had the ability with the use of this material to store and distribute enormous quantities of energy. Light waves, that's what it works through. It's been discovered now, and in fact just during the last few weeks it's been discovered that even the particles that we're looking at, which are these monatomic gold clusters, when you get down to their atoms, even the atoms now aren't solid. They are not physical property, they are a gaseous substance. So it's no wonder they will levitate and whatever. You know, there's nothing to them. But cooling will make them heavy. Two superconductors can be linked together. You can trigger one in, down here in LA, and you can decide to send electricity to Chicago. All you have to do is the resonance frequency the two of them together, just to get them in tune, like a couple of tuning forks or whatever. And you turn it off and you can go away for 100 years and come back and it will still be flowing until you decide to turn off that triggering mechanism. So Hudson got very, very, very excited about all this, and he went along to the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin, and he met with the director there, a fellow called Hal Puthoff, who many of you might know or know of. And Hal Puthoff is famous for his studies of zero-point gravity and vacuum energy, that sort of thing. What Puthoff had established, he'd been working on gravity calculations by the Russian physicist Andrei Sakharov from the 60s, and he'd been working out the mathematics for this, and he'd worked out that matter was capable of resonating in different dimensions that weren't ours. But what he calculated mathematically from Sakharov's work was that the moment it begins to do that, at that moment, the moment you know it's on the change, just hooking into the beginnings of another dimension, it will automatically lose 4/9 of its weight. And Hudson went along, he said, look, this is really interesting because 44% mine's losing, and that's the same, it's the same figure, 4/9. And so they agreed, well, yeah, I mean, it's because this stuff is beginning to resonate in another dimension. That's what's happening to it. It should disappear totally, he was told, if it carries on, and he said, it does. Disappears totally. We don't know where it goes, it just disappears. So they decided to test this. And they said that, look, the way to do it is this. If you have a little pile of powder in a pan and it becomes invisible, that means it's still there, but you can't see it. So if you've got a spatula and messed it up in the pan, it would come back, when it comes back, in a mess. But we suspect that yours won't. We suspect it will come back in the same shape that it disappeared in. And that's exactly what happened. It didn't come back in a mess. It came back looking exactly like it had disappeared, in that same perfect shape. There you are, they said. It's not invisible. It has simply moved out of our space-time, and it's now been brought back into it. Well, from that moment in time and around that moment in time, scientists all over the world were talking about these hyperdimensions. Britain's Stephen Hawking, the famous Cambridge professor, Sir Martin Rees, our astrologer royal over there. It took a lot of people by surprise, really. They were saying that there are realms that exist around us and within our environment that we know nothing about. They called them hypersystems. They didn't know how to explain them, and they were coming up with drawings of this sort, trying to explain these sort of parallel situations, but it didn't really work. Such pictures didn't prove anything. It was demonstrated that the concept of another dimension was demonstrated by Cubist art, of all things. Cubist art was based on a principle of showing the dimensions that we can't see. And they had this wonderful thing which they called the Great Prismosaurus. Now, the Great Prismosaurus is an article with millions of facets on it, but it actually has a fourth dimension for everything. Everything that you can see the outside of, you can also see the inside of. What are these dimensions? Well, Martin Rees explains that our dimension is called three-dimensional because it goes up or down, or left to right, or backwards and forwards. We have no objective perception of it. We just live within this realm. There are other universes, they say. Some are crumbled up, so small that we can't even imagine them, but they're accessible. Others, they say, are a millimetre away from us. It's the world where Einstein's theory of then, now, and the future all coming into play at once. It's looking at the 30-storey building from outside as against being in it on its 15th floor. On the 15th floor, you perceive the 15th floor. You can look out of the window and know that you're part of something bigger, but you can't see the other floors. Well, the other dimensions are, in fact, those other floors. You can move into them, you can travel up and you can travel down, but you have to know how. You have to know how to trigger it. They say that gravity, they now understand, gravity is actually a signal leaking out of one of these other dimensions into ours. That's where they say the power of gravity comes from. So we're in this bubble, they say. Our whole universe is a bubble wrapped inside other bubbles that are wrapped inside other bubbles. People like NASA come on the scene and they say, yeah, well, it will be very easy. You know, we can move things between dimensions. We're not actually doing it yet, but we know how to do it because it's really a matter of resonance frequencies. All you have to do is to tune the locations to each other, just like setting up your radio onto a station. You know, when you get it in the right place, the message comes through. Treat it like tuning forks. Set up the vibrations between them. That way we can send anything we want, they say. We can send pictures, we can send text, we can send physical matter. What we've seen over the past 6 or 7 years now is an increasing awareness in the science press of the DNA links with these materials and how important they're becoming. They've talked about how they can be used to re-coordinate the uncontrolled division of body cells. This particular article here from Scientific American, the way it reads is this, that they place these elements at the end of the strands. The researchers examined the electrical properties of short lengths of double helix DNA in which there was a ruthenium atom at each end of one of the strands. Mead and Khayyam, the scientists, estimated from earlier studies that a short single strand of DNA ought to conduct up to 100 electrons a second. Imagine their astonishment when they measured the flow along the ruthenium-doped double helix to find that the current was up by a factor of more than 10,000 times. It was as if, they said, the double helix was behaving like a piece of molecular wire. Wow. It's our monatomic gold wires. They're able to turn the DNA into becoming a part of its structure, or vice versa. The two things can become one. By this means that they build up an integrated circuit of light within the body, and they have the ability to perform cell correction. DNA has memory. what does the memory do? It tells the DNA what it should look like. It tells the cell structure what it should be. What is cancer then? Cancer is malformed or deformed cellular structure. That's all it is. It might be horrific, but it's basically very simple. It's DNA in a muddle. How do you correct it? You make it 10,000 times more intelligent, and the DNA says to itself, I shouldn't be like this. I'm supposed to be like this. And it changes. It will reconfigure itself correctly in accordance with the way it should be. This is cancer treatment that involves no surgery. It involves no drugs. It involves no radiation. It leaves the immune system intact. And suddenly the light of life has become a truly life-giving substance. None of it is about being anti-cancer. This is the interesting thing. And AIDS and all of these types of disease, it's not anti-anything. It's pro-life. And the thing that has amazed doctors is that you can actually cure cancers by thinking about preserving life. Everything that they've done up to date has been the opposite. It's about killing cancer. And in doing that, you're destroying DNA, you're destroying body tissue, you're destroying cellular structure, you're affecting their immune system. Because the rule was that nobody said you had to have a good quality of life after the cancer had been killed. What they had to do was to kill the cancer. Well, the best cancer cure on that basis is a bullet through the head. That's killed the cancer. Well, now what they're looking at is the potential for not killing the cancer, but for giving the body back the life resonances that it should have had. And now scientists are saying, yeah, the light body. All of this stuff connects together within us in light waves. We now know how to begin to manipulate those light waves. Yes, you can work in a lab and you can attach 2 atoms of gold or ruthenium or whatever to a DNA strand. How the heck do you do that in a live body? We see now that because of this, what they're working on is a very straightforward process that enables them to do exactly that. They can move into body areas with little devices such as this fellow. These are machines, computers more powerful than anything you have on your desk in your office or at home, which are capable of performing these microscopic little bits of surgery, for want of another name. They will place the atoms at the end of DNA strands. They can be devised to do just that. In fact, we could have them all the time so that we never actually got out of whack anyway, because they would see it coming and correct it. Monatomic elements have anti-aging properties, we're told. They correct DNA, they interact with DNA. They are devices which can affect the hormonal structure of the body. This is a really interesting medical area. Each of the original metals seems to have a relationship to one or the other of the glands in our endocrinal system. Gold seems to link up with the pineal gland, for example. Iridium seems to link up with the pituitary gland. These substances, whether ingested or injected or whatever, they can affect and heighten and enhance the hormonal secretions from any of these chosen or selected glands. It's a science which now puts paid to the problems associated with hormone replacement therapy, for example. You know, it's a therapy which is very popular. It works to an extent. It has some funny side effects, but in the end, all they're really doing is dosing human beings up with the hormones from the desiccated glands of dead animals. Well, there's not a lot of point in that. Far better if they can find a way to make more of our own. So why not enhance the pineal gland to produce more melatonin? Why not enhance the pituitary gland to produce more serotonin? So that's the area that they're moving into now, and these materials will do exactly that. In today's world, the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin in Texas has described these materials as exotic matter. It can think of no better way to explain them. They're exotic. They conform to no rules, and that they're not like anything else they've ever known. They are not on the periodic table of elements. Science has never known about them until the last few years. The Center for Advanced Study in Illinois classifies superconductivity, which is one of their main attributes, as the most remarkable property in the universe. So we've got something pretty amazing here. We've got a very ordinary looking white powder which is exotic beyond any comparison and contains abilities which are the most remarkable properties in the universe. And yet it appears like some grains maybe of talcum powder. So we sort of move towards rounding up here. Manipulation of space-time has been something they've been talking about for about the last 5 to 7 years. A fellow here called Miguel Alcubierre. He's a Mexican mathematical scientist involved with the Max Planck Institute in Germany, was working at the time in 1994 for the University of Wales over in Britain. This is the abstract at the beginning of a multi-page document that he wrote, the journal Classical and Quantum Gravity, which caused quite a stir worldwide. He didn't pose any questions, he didn't say that this is what we're researching. He began his article with, "We now know." In fact, the abstract reads, "It is now known that it's possible to modify space-time in a way that allows a spaceship to travel at an arbitrarily large speed by a purely local expansion of the space-time behind the ship and an opposite contraction in front of it. A motion faster than the speed of light, reminiscent of the warp drive of science fiction." Well, we're back to the sort of questions that we have with the DNA and the strands. How do we solve our space travel problems? We know that people's lives can't last long enough to get to the distant stars. We know that our machinery and metals can't. We know that the fuel runs out. We know that these things are inordinate distances away. How do we deal with it? We deal with it laterally, as Alcubierre suggests. We think about it differently. We forget about the spacecraft. What do? We look at the spacecraft, we look at the million light years that it has to travel, and we know that that's impossible. So why don't we just take the million light years and put it behind the spacecraft? Why don't we think about that? Why not move the space-time instead of the craft, so that with zero propulsion and no time having gone by, it can move through a million light years because you've simply screwed that up, tossed it behind it, opened it up again, and it says, "It is now possible to modify space-time." Well, yes, it is. He was absolutely correct. It is now possible. This was followed in a series of related articles. American scientist, article written by the physicist Michael Spear. He showed that this had nothing to do with violating Einstein's theory, the theory that nothing can travel faster than light. It didn't violate that at all because nothing would be traveling anywhere. It would be staying still. Space-time would be moving. The acceleration rate, he said, would be enormous in theory, but there wouldn't actually be any. The true acceleration would be zero. Fuel consumption, zero. Time taken, zero. Distance travelled, million light years, maybe. So the question was raised, okay, it's possible, how is it possible? What's the device that makes it possible? And the answer came back loud and clear, exotic matter will be needed to generate distortions of space-time. The next question that went back was, what is exotic matter? Exotic matter, here's the description, it has the curious property of having a negative energy density, unlike normal matter that we're familiar with that makes up the people and the planets and the stars, which has positive energy density. The necessary exotic device is an operative superconductor. And in fact, the list of what exotic matter is the same list of every attribute that applied from the research tests on monatomic superconductive elements. They're the only substance ever to have been classified as exotic matter. What's needed to generate distortions in space-time? Exotic matter. What does bending space-time mean? It means the ability to move from one dimension into another. What did this stuff prove that it can do? Move from one dimension into another and be brought back again. This is NASA's rather unattractive picture of what they call now their warp drive program. Believe it or not, NASA have a warp drive program. They're using Star Trek terminology, and this is their sort of logo picture for it. We have here Hal Puthoff from the Institute of Advanced Study comes back on the scene. He talks about the warp drive program and about the concept of bending space-time and manipulating and distorting it. And his comment is this: the details which provide yet further support for the concept that reduced time interstellar travel, either by advanced extraterrestrial civilizations at present or by ourselves in the future, is not fundamentally constrained by physical principles. We cannot enter research any day, he's saying, trying to constrain the possibility of our discoveries by the laws of physics that were applied yesterday, because they are already outdated. It's now been discovered that superconductors are the key to the distance teleportation of matter. This is from the United States Department of Energy. The technique is to prepare a couple of quantum systems some distance apart. We take a digital measurement of the local system and transmit this to reconstitute a new quantum on the other side. It's actually the same as any of you sending a digital image from your computer to one of your other computers. It's simply changing it into a digital thing that can be transmitted through frequencies and sending it and reconstituting it where it appears. Except that we're not talking about images, we're talking about physical reality. Most significantly, continues the US Department of Energy, most significantly, by this means even people could be transported by sending enough classical information. So, they're on the borders of it now. We now have a situation where we have, like in the medical race, we have a race between those people thinking in terms of anti-gravity aircraft and bending space-time to get spacecraft through situations, but we have this other stuff going on which actually says to us, by the time we get there we won't need machines to travel in at all. We'll be able to teleport anyway. Scientists at NASA, at Argonne National Labs, up there in Chicago, all sorts of institutes around the world, at the Bose Institute of Calcutta and universities wherever, have all stated now that they have been able to link particle elements together, no matter how far apart they are, whether it's single atoms or trillions of atoms, they can link them together. So the sciences, all of these quantum sciences now, whether it's in Vienna, in Denmark, or here in the United States, they're all moving into the forefront. Everything's being called nano, everything's being called quantum, how much? They make the point of the problem that we face, and it's just like the cancer and the DNA, it's a massive problem with a very small answer. Proxima Centauri is our nearest star. Our next star is 4.2 light years away. That's 4.5 years travelling at the speed of light. The Voyager spacecraft left our atmosphere at 37,000 miles an hour. Even at that speed, it would take it 87,000 years to get to that star. There's no way we can do it. It's impossible. Everything dies, everything collapses, everything runs out, falls apart in the course of it, unless you take the space-time away. That's what they're working on now. That's what they're having to do. Nothing travels faster than light, they say, but we need to travel faster than light in order to make any headway. If travelling faster than light is impossible, the only alternative is to approach the problem from a different perspective. We must learn how to manipulate and distort space-time. The Ohio Aerospace Institute says that all of this is possible now because it's been recognised that space is just like any other matter. It has a form, it has a shape, it can be bent, it can be distorted. And how did they recognise that? Because when the white light explosions occurred and 44% suddenly disappeared, it was a blaze of light, but light has no weight. So what was happening here? Light has no weight, it simply illuminates space-time. Oh, maybe it's the space-time that weighs 44%. Yes, it was. Space-time has weight. It's physical matter. Among the forms of exotic matter, they're now examining with great interest is something called stardust. Microscopic grains from way beyond our environment up there, way beyond the stratosphere, ionosphere, and these grains are found as particles, no more than 6 in every 100,000 other particles of dust up there. It's the oldest substance known to exist. It actually holds the reasoning for why we have life on this planet and how it works and how it originates. What does it test as? A very strange, unique form of silica that doesn't seem to be anything except they know it has a metallic base, but it's not showing up in the tests. Sounds familiar? Sounds very familiar. This is a conglomeration of particles within which, somewhere in there, is a stardust particle in this minuscule thing. What they've ascertained and the way that they recognize it is that they say that they have discovered it on Earth. That's how they understand it. They found it in deep seabed sediments. They found it in Arctic ice. They found it in those parts of the Earth which they consider were the first and oldest of what we can get to today. And some of it, strangely enough, in asteroid and very, very ancient meteorite sites, Arizona being very famous in that regard. They say stardust will reveal more than we ever guessed we could know about life on this planet. Stardust is golden. They've used the phrase. They've got this spacecraft up there right now. It's called Stardust. It's hoping to bring back about 100 particles. It'll bring them back and they'll be tested at the Johnson Space Center from January 2006. And how does it collect them? How does it distinguish 6 out of every 100,000 other dust particles when it's going through millions of thousands of them at a time? This device on the top there, this grid thing, is full of something called aerogel. Aerogel looks like nothing. It weighs absolutely nothing. There she is balancing it on her fingertips. It can be penetrated by nothing. Not even heat can get through it. That Bunsen burner is having no effect on those wax crayons. Aerogel is absolutely and totally heat resistant. It will withstand particle and granular impacts of 60,000 odd miles an hour. Why is it called aerogel? Because it's made from air. 98% of that is air, nothing else at all. 2%, they won't tell us. It's a secret, but wow, what a secret that is. Why have we always known that gold was valuable? Why have we always hoarded gold? We've done it for as long as we can think. From the 1840s, when the California gold rush began, I'm told by the World Gold Council that to that point in time, only 10% of all the gold ever mined up until today's date had been mined. 90% of all the gold ever mined to now has been done since the 1840s. Think of ancient Egypt. Think of Russia and its wonderful golden domes. Think of the way that gold was so visible throughout the whole of history. That was 10%. Where's the 90%? We pay fortunes to put a little bit on our wrist or our finger. Where's the rest? Well, we dig it up underground and we bring it up top, we clean it up, we melt it down, we turn it into gold bars and we bury it back under the ground again. A wonderful system. Nobody ever sees it. It underpins everything, but now they're selling it. Who are they selling it to? Interesting question. We have about 30 years of oil at best left in the world if we're lucky. Coal is just about done for. I mean, everything's getting too expensive now. We don't really want to burn stuff and pollute the atmosphere. So alongside the drug companies, the oil companies are really feeling the pinch as well. So who's buying the materials? I have a theory that probably it's the oil and drug companies, putting themselves in a position to become tomorrow's masters of the new source materials. Everything begins to link. You know, stardust is now the secret holder of the force of life. It's the origin of life. It's the giver of life. Well, so were monatomic elements. So were the ancients saying about the shamana and the mufkut. It was all the same thing. Every description of these substances was always the same. We think about the Bible story, we think about how we can make monatomic elements now. We need electronic devices, we need fire, we need all sorts of things. But we need electricity. In one way or another, we need electricity. And this is the one bit of the equation that has to be got through very quickly, because this is our last remnant, we think, about electricity. How are we going to produce electricity to manufacture our fuel cells if we don't have the fossil fuels to have our power stations? We get electricity from its most natural source, which is around us all the time. What we need is a device that will attract electricity, that will store electricity, that will discharge electricity in a very controllable form, in enormous quantities. However, we need to do it. That's all the Ark of the Covenant ever did and all it ever was. If you look at the construction of the Ark of the Covenant, it is no more than a model for every capacitor made today, whether it's a capacitor for lighting up street lighting or whatever. An insulated, double-plated box with a positive and a negative node at the top. That's it, that's all it is. And you look at the description of the Ark of the Covenant in the Bible, which is given twice. You take every measurement, you manufacture it with the materials that it says in accordance with everything it tells you, and you have a 100,000 volt immediate electronic capacitor. You do what the Bible says and you place an ohmer of the Shemanah in it, golden pot of the white powder, you place it in there, you've immediately got a superconductor. You've immediately got a device that sets up its own Meissner field, which will levitate, which will be able to travel on its own, which will be able to issue gamma rays or whatever you need it to do. A very, very powerful device. We have to go back to these very simple devices that simply pull it in and hold it and issue it. The Ark of the Covenant is not wrongly named. It's spelt with a K in the Bible because that was the Greek way of spelling it. In every other language it's spelt with a C, and electronic arcing actually comes from that very same word. So everybody's now working on all of these things. NASA has developed its Breakthrough Propulsion Physics Project. That's what it calls it. What's the Breakthrough Propulsion Physics Project? It's how to get the stars by bending and manipulating space-time. That's what they're working on right now. Anti-gravity, that's the other thing. That's not necessarily just about spacecraft, that's about ordinary aircraft. Quite a lot in the press and on the internet, here from the UK Ministry of Defence and from the BBC. Anti-gravity propulsion is coming out of the closet, says Defence Weekly. Well, to this end, British Aerospace over in Britain has embarked on Project Green Glow. Over here at the top secret Phantom Works in Seattle, Boeing technicians are working on Project Grasp. They're very, very similar. They're both looking at anti-gravity aircraft. Why do we need aircraft that can fall down? We want aircraft that just stay in their frequencies and go wherever we turn the knob to tell them to go. In fact, they don't need pilots, really. Just send them places. This picture here is British Aerospace's latest design for a new stealth aircraft. Why do we just have to have something that radar can't see when we can actually produce things that we can't see? In fact, we can produce things that aren't even invisible. They're not in our time dimension. They've moved from our visible plane. Wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a stealth aircraft that simply left here and couldn't be seen by anybody because it wasn't there, because it was travelling in a different dimension and simply came back where we wanted it to be? Now, by the same token, on that basis, why couldn't ordinary aircraft, our passenger liners, travel in that same way? It doesn't have to be a bomber. It doesn't have to be that. You know, why can't we all be travelling in different parallel dimensions and getting to places in 5 seconds instead of it taking 11 hours every time I come over here? We are finding the place where the stardust, the monatomic elements, meet the stargate and will take us into the world of other dimensions, so that suddenly, as Puthoff says, we can't apply the laws of physics anymore. We have a whole new set of rules that belong to worlds and realms that we knew nothing about until now. We get to that point and just about everything that was impossible becomes possible. Thank you. That's it.